In the dead of winter, 1868, Elizabeth Winters held her husband's cold hand and made a promise. "I'll keep them safe," she whispered, her breath fogging in the frigid air of their small cabin. Jonathan was gone. The sickness that had swept through Crawford's mill like a phantom had taken him, and now Elizabeth was alone with her 7-year-old twin daughters, Sarah and Hannah. Her grief was a stone in her chest, heavy and cold. But she had no time to mourn, because just as the last of Jonathan's warmth faded from the room, there came a knock at the door. It wasn't a gentle rap of sympathy from a neighbor. It was a hard, impatient sound, a demand. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, and walked to the door. Her promise to Jonathan was only seconds old, and she could already feel it being tested. She pulled the heavy wooden door inward, and the biting Wyoming wind was the least of the evils that greeted her. 4 men stood on her porch, their faces grim in the gray morning light. At the front was Sherman Crawford, the founder of the settlement, a man whose ambition was as vast and as cold as the landscape around them. He held his hat in his hands, but it was no gesture of respect. It was a mockery. "Mrs. Winters," Crawford said, his voice flat, "we've made a decision." Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that these men were not here to offer comfort. They were here to pass judgment. "A decision about what?" she asked, her voice trembling only slightly. Crawford's eyes, small and hard like pebbles, swept past her into the cabin, as if taking inventory of her meager possessions. He was calculating, always calculating. "Your husband," Crawford said. "He was the first to fall ill after trading with the Cheyenne 2 weeks ago." It was a lie, a venomous, calculated lie. The sickness had started with Crawford's own cousin, but in a town ruled by fear, the truth was a fragile thing. Crawford let the lie hang in the air, letting it poison the space between them. "He brought this plague upon us," Crawford continued, his voice rising, performing for the men behind him. "And now, with him gone, you and your girls, you are a drain on our resources." Elizabeth stared at him, the world tilting on its axis. A drain. That's all they were to him. Not a grieving family, not neighbors, just 3 more mouths to feed in a winter that was already threatening to starve them all. "The settlement has voted," Crawford declared, his tone final. "You are to leave by dawn tomorrow. Leave into the wilderness, into a blizzard that was already brewing on the horizon." It wasn't a banishment. It was a death sentence. "You can't," Elizabeth pleaded, her voice cracking. "My daughters, they're just children." Crawford's face remained a mask of stone. "That's your burden, not ours," he said. "We'll provide you with a wagon, 1 horse, and enough food for a week. There's a military outpost 3 days east. More than you deserve, some would say." He handed her a crudely drawn map, a piece of paper that felt as flimsy as her hopes. Elizabeth looked at the faces of the other men, searching for a flicker of humanity, a hint of doubt. She found none. They were followers, their wills long since surrendered to Crawford's. She realized then that this wasn't about the sickness or the supplies. It was about her husband, Jonathan. He had been a principled man who believed the native tribes deserved respect, a view that directly challenged Crawford's iron-fisted rule, and his belief that the land was his for the taking. With Jonathan gone, his family was just a loose end to be snipped. "Be ready at dawn," Crawford repeated, turning to leave, "or you will be removed by force." The men departed, their boots crunching in the snow, leaving Elizabeth alone in the doorway, the cold seeping into her bones. Despair washed over her, a crushing wave that threatened to pull her under. But then, from the loft above, she heard a small cough. Hannah. The sound was a lifeline. She slammed the door shut, the noise echoing the fury and resolve solidifying in her heart. Jonathan had made her promise, and Sherman Crawford had just shown her how cruel the world could be. She would not die in the snow. She would not let her daughters perish because of one man's greed and hatred. She looked at the map Crawford had given her, a military outpost 3 days east, a flicker of hope. But as she studied the crude lines, a detail snagged her attention. A small landmark, a twisted pine tree Jonathan had pointed out to her on a walk last autumn. He told her a story about how the local trappers called the pass it marked Widow's Pass, because no one who entered it in winter ever came out. Crawford hadn't given her a map to salvation. He had given her a map to her grave, and that changed everything. Through the long, dark night, Elizabeth packed not as a refugee, but as a soldier preparing for war. She gathered every blanket, every scrap of dried meat, every candle. She packed Jonathan's heavy tools, his axe, his saw, his hammer. They were heavy and practical for a journey on foot, but they were a piece of him, a tangible link to his strength. She found his old compass, a small brass disc that felt like a sacred relic in her hand. Crawford wanted her to go east, into a trap, so she would go south, into the unknown. She woke the girls before the first hint of light, her movements calm and deliberate. "We're going on an adventure, my darling," she said, her voice a gentle murmur that belied the storm raging inside her. "A journey to find a new home, a better one." The twins, their blue eyes wide with a mixture of sleep and confusion, trusted her completely. They were their father's daughters, full of quiet courage. As dawn broke, a wagon stood waiting, hitched to a single ancient-looking horse. Crawford was there, a smug look on his face, watching as she loaded her meager possessions. He expected tears. He expected pleading. He got neither. Elizabeth moved with a cold, efficient fury that seemed to unnerve him. Just as she was about to lift the girls into the wagon, Martha Jenkins, the settlement's midwife, hurried over, pressing a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into her hand. "Herbs for fever," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward Crawford, "and a bit of extra jerky. God be with you, Elizabeth." It was a small act of rebellion, a spark of kindness in a sea of cruelty, and it meant the world. With a final defiant look at Crawford, Elizabeth climbed onto the wagon seat. She didn't click her tongue or slap the reins. She simply whispered, "Go!" And the old horse, as if sensing the urgency, began to pull. The wagon creaked forward, leaving Crawford's mill behind. As they cleared the last cabin, Elizabeth unfolded Crawford's map, held it up for a moment, and then let it slip from her fingers, a white ghost fluttering into the snow. She turned the wagon south, guided only by her husband's compass and a promise. The first day was a brutal struggle. The snow was deep, and the wind was a knife, cutting through their layers of clothing. The old horse strained with every step, its breath pluming in the frigid air. By nightfall, they had made camp in the shelter of a sparse grove of pines. As Elizabeth built a fire, she examined the horse's front leg. She'd noticed a slight limp all day, and what she found made her blood run cold. Tucked deep into the horse's hoof was a carefully placed nail, angled to cause pain and slow them down, but not to cripple the animal immediately. It wasn't just an old horse, it was a sabotaged one. This was the work of Silas Tanner, Crawford's right-hand man, a cruel and meticulous sycophant. Crawford hadn't just pointed them toward a deadly pass. He had ensured they would never even reach it. He wanted them to die out here, slowly, miserably, close enough that their failure would serve as a warning to anyone else who dared to defy him. A new, colder wave of fury washed over Elizabeth. This wasn't just banishment. It was premeditated murder. That night, as the twins slept huddled beside her, Elizabeth didn't pray. She planned. The next day, the sky turned a bruised, ominous gray. The wind picked up, howling like a hungry wolf, and the first flakes of a blizzard began to fall. The horse's limp grew worse, its strength failing. They were moving at a crawl, losing the race against the storm. Elizabeth knew they needed shelter, and fast. Through the swirling snow, she spotted it, a dark shape on the horizon, a rocky outcropping that might offer some protection. "Hold on, girl!" she yelled over the wind, urging the horse toward the rocks. They were less than half a mile away when it happened. The horse stumbled, its sabotaged leg finally giving out. With a pained cry, it collapsed in the snow, the wagon lurching violently to one side. The harness snapped, and the wagon's front wheel splintered with a crack like a rifle shot. They were stranded, in the open, with a blizzard descending upon them. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Elizabeth's resolve. For a heartbeat, she froze. But then Sarah's small gloved hand slipped into hers. "It's all right, Mama," the little girl said, her voice steady. "Papa taught us how to be brave." That was all it took. Elizabeth sprang into action, her movements swift and sure. She grabbed the most essential supplies: blankets, food, matches, Jonathan's axe. She pulled the girls from the broken wagon, their faces pale but determined. "We have to reach those rocks," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Hold hands, don't let go." They formed a three-person chain against the storm, a tiny, defiant island in a sea of white. Elizabeth broke the trail, her legs screaming with effort as she pushed through the deepening drifts. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath, but they pressed on, step by agonizing step. It felt like an eternity, but finally they stumbled into the relative shelter of the rocks. It wasn't a cave, just a shallow overhang, but it was enough to blunt the full force of the wind. Elizabeth's fingers were numb, but she managed to get a small fire started. As the flames flickered to life, she huddled with her daughters, wrapping them in every blanket she had, even her own coat. As darkness fell, the storm unleashed its full fury. The wind shrieked, and the snow fell so thick it was like a suffocating curtain. Elizabeth knew, with a terrifying clarity, that the fire was their life. If it went out, they would not see the morning. To keep the girls' spirits up in her own, she told them stories. Stories of brave queens and clever princesses, of sun-drenched meadows and warm summer days. But as the hours wore on, her own hope began to flicker, like the fire she so desperately tended. The provisions wouldn't last. Their shelter was inadequate. The sheer, brutal math of their situation was undeniable. They were going to die here. As the first gray hint of dawn filtered through the blizzard, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was faint at first, a rhythmic crunching. Elizabeth strained to listen. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps. But who would be out in a storm like this? A surge of desperate hope shot through her. A rescue party? Had Martha Jenkins convinced someone to come after them? She peered out from their shelter, her eyes scanning the white chaos. And then she saw them. Dark shapes moving through the snow. Not one person, but five. They were on horseback, moving with a purpose and skill that defied the storm. For a moment she thought they might be soldiers. But as they drew closer, she saw the long, dark braids, the buffalo robes, the unmistakable profile of Plains warriors. It was a Cheyenne hunting party. Everything she had ever been taught, every whispered story in Crawford's mill, screamed at her to hide. Savages, bloodthirsty, killers. But Jonathan's voice echoed in her memory. Judge a man by his actions, Lizzie, not by the color of his skin. They were freezing. They were starving. They were dying. What choice did she have? The decision was made for her when Hannah, peering from behind her, let out a small, frightened cry. The lead rider stopped instantly, his head snapping in their direction. He had heard her. He raised a hand, and the other riders halted behind him. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his pony and began to ride directly toward their shelter. Elizabeth pushed the twins behind her, her hand instinctively going to the small hunting knife Jonathan had given her. The rider stopped about 20 feet away, his face partially covered by a wolf fur wrap, but his eyes were visible, dark, intelligent, and unreadable. He studied the scene before him, a white woman and two small children, huddled and half-frozen in a pathetic shelter. He spoke, his voice deep, the words in a language she didn't understand. She shook her head, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He tried again, this time in halting, heavily accented English. "You are lost." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Elizabeth could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. The man's gaze fell on the twins, who peeked out from behind their mother, their identical faces a mixture of terror and curiosity. He spoke to his companions, his tone measured, before turning back to her. "Storm grows worse," he said, gesturing at the sky with a gloved hand. "You die here." The blunt truth of his words hit her harder than the wind. He was right. "Can you help us?" she asked, the words a desperate plea. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The man was silent for a long, agonizing moment. His dark eyes seemed to pierce right through her, weighing her, judging her. Elizabeth held her breath, the fate of her children hanging on this stranger's decision. Finally, he gave a single, decisive nod. I am Two Bears, he said, touching his chest. Chief of this party, you will come with us. Relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over Elizabeth. But it was immediately followed by a new, chilling thought. The Cheyenne were Jonathan's friends, the very people Crawford had used as a scapegoat. What would this chief do if he learned that she was from the settlement that falsely blamed his people for their plague? The help he offered could turn to vengeance in a heartbeat. She was trading one certain death for another, far more uncertain one. The journey to the Cheyenne camp was a frozen nightmare. Elizabeth rode on a pony with Hannah in front of her, Sarah on another with a young warrior. They were wrapped in heavy buffalo robes, a kindness that did little to warm the ice in Elizabeth's veins. She had no idea where they were going, only that they were moving deeper into a wilderness her people had taught her to fear, into the hands of a people her neighbors had taught her to hate. After what felt like hours, they descended into a sheltered valley. Smoke rose from a collection of 20 or so hide lodges, a village hidden from the storm. As they entered the camp, figures emerged from the teepees, their faces a mixture of surprise and suspicion at the sight of the white woman and her children. Two Bears dismounted and spoke to the gathered crowd in his own language. Elizabeth couldn't understand the words, but she could read the faces. They were not all welcoming. Some looked at her with open hostility. An elderly woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles and her bearing regal, stepped forward. "My mother, sage woman," Two Bears said to Elizabeth, "medicine woman of our people. You will stay in her lodge." Sage Woman's eyes were as sharp and intelligent as her son's. She looked Elizabeth and the twins up and down, her gaze lingering on their pale, frost-nipped faces. Then she spoke in clear English. "The children are cold. Come." The inside of her lodge was a different world. It was warm, smoky, and filled with the scent of herbs and burning sage. Soft furs covered the ground. Sage Woman immediately tended to the twins, her movements efficient and gentle. She examined their hands and feet, clucking her tongue at the sight of the frostbite, and gave them a warm, bitter tea that sent heat spreading through their chilled bodies. "You have a husband?" Sage Woman asked, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth. Elizabeth's throat tightened. "He died," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of the sickness. They made us leave." Sage Woman's expression didn't change, but a flicker of understanding entered her eyes. "White people fear what they do not understand," she said. "They look for someone to blame." The simple, profound truth of her words resonated deep within Elizabeth. Later, after the girls had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Two Bears entered the lodge. He sat across the fire from her, his face a stern mask. "The storm will last 2 more days," he said. "When it ends, where will you go?" Elizabeth hesitated. "Crawford's Mill," she finally said, deciding that a partial truth was safer than a full one. "Our settlement. They will be looking for us." Two Bears studied her, his gaze unwavering. "Crawford's Mill," he repeated slowly. "I know this place. The man Crawford trades lies as easily as he trades furs." A cold dread trickled down Elizabeth's spine. He knew Crawford. "Why did they send a woman and 2 children into a blizzard?" Two Bears pressed, his voice like flint. "This is the act of a coward, not a leader." Elizabeth's mind raced. The lie was unraveling before it was even fully spun. If she told him the truth, that Crawford had banished them, blaming the Cheyenne for the sickness, his compassion could turn to rage. He might see her not as a victim, but as a part of the enemy, a representative of the people who had slandered his own. Her daughters were sleeping just feet away, vulnerable and trusting. A wrong word now could seal their fate. She had to choose her next words more carefully than any others in her life. "There was a misunderstanding," Elizabeth began, her voice strained. "A disagreement." Two Bears leaned forward, the firelight casting harsh shadows on his face. "White men have many words for their cruelty," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Misunderstanding, disagreement, progress. I want the true word, Elizabeth Winters." He knew her name. How did he know her name? He had never asked. Panic began to claw at her throat. Had they met before? Had Jonathan spoken of them? Or was there something else? Something she couldn't possibly know? The chief's eyes narrowed. "Your husband, Jonathan Winters, the carpenter. He came to my camp last fall. He traded goods, but more than that, he traded respect. He spoke of his wife, a woman with hair like the setting sun, and his twin daughters, the Sunrise Sisters, he called them. Elizabeth stared at him, speechless. Jonathan had been here. He had known these people. He had spoken of them. This wasn't a random encounter in a storm. This was something else entirely. Jonathan was a good man, Two Bears continued, his voice softening slightly. He spoke of the greed in his settlement. He spoke of a man named Crawford who saw our people as obstacles to be removed. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the small lodge. So I ask you again, why did this man send the family of my friend to die in the snow? The truth. He wanted the truth. And she realized in that terrifying moment that a lie would be the deadliest insult of all. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she met his gaze. Crawford told the settlement that Jonathan caught the sickness from your people, she said, the words tumbling out. He used it as an excuse. He said we were a burden. He banished us. She watched his face, expecting the anger, the fury. Instead, his expression became one of deep, sorrowful understanding. It is as I feared, he said quietly. The coward blames the wolf for the disease spread by his own rats. He looked at her, his eyes filled not with vengeance, but with a grim resolve. You cannot go back to that place. It is a village of snakes. I have nowhere else to go, Elizabeth whispered. You will stay here, Two Bears declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. You are the family of a friend. You are under my protection. Relief flooded her, so intense it was dizzying, but it was short-lived. A new voice spoke from the entrance of the lodge, sharp and hostile. You would bring vipers into our home, Two Bears? A warrior, his face scarred and his eyes burning with anger, stepped inside. She is from the town of liars. Her people would see us all dead. This was Stoneheart, a rival to Two Bears, a man known for his hatred of the settlers. His gaze fell on Elizabeth like a physical blow. This woman is not a guest, Stoneheart snarled. She is a plague. The soldiers will follow her here, and they will bring their fire and their steel. The fragile peace of the lodge shattered. Elizabeth was no longer a rescued widow. She was a spark, thrown into a powder keg of tribal politics and old hatreds, a conflict that could consume them all. The days that followed were a tightrope walk over a chasm of tension. While Two Bears had declared them under his protection, Stoneheart's faction watched Elizabeth and her daughters with undisguised hostility. The twins, with the innocent fearlessness of children, were largely oblivious, quickly befriending the other children and learning Cheyenne words from Two Bears' niece, Morningbird. But Elizabeth felt the weight of every suspicious glance, every whispered conversation that fell silent when she approached. She learned that Two Bears' decision to help her was a massive political gamble. His authority as chief depended on his ability to protect his people, and many, like Stoneheart, saw her presence as a direct threat to their safety. She tried to make herself useful, helping the women with their daily chores. Her hands, strong from years of hard work, proved adept at scraping hides and grinding corn. She was a quick learner, and slowly, she began to earn a measure of grudging respect from some of the women, including Sage Woman, who seemed to see something in Elizabeth that others did not. One evening, Sage Woman beckoned her to sit by the fire. Stoneheart is not evil, the old woman said, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. He is afraid. He saw his own family killed by blue coats when he was a boy. His hatred is a shield for his pain. This glimpse into her adversary's past didn't make him less threatening, but it made him more human. He believes I will bring the soldiers here, Elizabeth said. He may be right, Sage Woman replied, her dark eyes searching Elizabeth's. Fear is a powerful medicine. It can make a man see shadows where there is only light, and it can make a prophecy come true. The old woman's words were chilling. A week passed, then two. The blizzard had long since ended, replaced by a period of clear, brutally cold weather. The snow lay thick on the ground, making travel impossible. They were here for the foreseeable future. Elizabeth found a strange rhythm in her new life. She was learning a new language, a new way of seeing the world, but always at the back of her mind was the fear of what lay beyond the valley. What had Crawford done when they didn't die in the snow as planned? She got her answer on a cold, clear morning. A Cheyenne scout rode into camp at a gallop, his horse lathered in sweat. He spoke urgently to Two Bears, gesturing back the way he had come. A council was called immediately. Elizabeth watched from a distance, her stomach twisting into a knot. When the meeting ended, Two Bears approached her, his face grave. "A column of soldiers is approaching from the north," he said. 30 men. They are following the tracks our hunting party left in the snow, the tracks that led us to you." Stoneheart's prophecy had come true. "They will be here by sunset tomorrow," Two Bears continued. Panic seized Elizabeth. "What will you do?" "We cannot move the camp in this snow," he said. "The women and children will be sent to a hidden camp. The warriors will prepare to fight." "My daughters and I will go with them," Elizabeth said quickly. Her presence had brought this danger. She would not make it worse. "No," Two Bears said, his voice firm. "You will stay." Elizabeth stared at him, confused. "Why? They are looking for me. If they find me here, they will assume I am a captive. They will attack." "That is one possibility," Two Bears acknowledged. "There is another. You are a white woman. You will go out to meet them. You will tell them we saved you. You will be the bridge of peace between our peoples." He was asking her to stand between two armies, to trust that the soldiers would listen to her, a lone woman, and not simply open fire. It was an insane risk. But then she looked at the faces of the children playing in the snow, her own daughters among them, and she knew she had no choice. "I will do it," she said. But as she agreed, she saw Stoneheart watching from across the camp. There was a look in his eyes that terrified her, not of anger, but of cold, calculating purpose. He did not believe in peace, and Elizabeth realized with a jolt of fear that the soldiers approaching were not the only threat she faced. Stoneheart would see any attempt at peace as a betrayal, and he would do anything to stop it. The camp was a hive of frantic, controlled activity. Warriors checked their weapons while women packed supplies for the evacuation. Elizabeth prepared herself, dressing in her cleanest clothes, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. Two Bears coached her on what to say, how to approach the soldiers with her hands visible. "Speak the truth," he said. "Truth is a weapon they will not expect." Just as she was about to take her position at the edge of the camp, Stoneheart confronted her, his two strongest warriors at his side. "The chief is a fool," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "He sends a dove to reason with hawks. You will not be allowed to speak to them." "Two Bears is your chief," Elizabeth countered, her heart pounding. "You must obey him." "My first duty is to the people," Stoneheart retorted, "and your words of peace will only bring their deaths. When the soldiers see you, they will charge. You are not a bridge. You are bait." He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "You will come with us. We will keep you hidden. When the soldiers attack, we will have a hostage." Before Elizabeth could scream, a figure moved with surprising speed. Sage Woman stood between them, her ancient frame frail, but her eyes blazing with authority. "You will not touch her, Stoneheart," she said, her voice ringing with power. "You defy your chief and you defy the spirits. Your fear makes you blind." Stoneheart hesitated, unwilling to physically challenge the tribe's revered medicine woman. In that moment of hesitation, Two Bears appeared, his face a thundercloud. "You are relieved of your command, Stoneheart," the chief said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will remain in your lodge. If you disobey, you will be cast out." Stoneheart stared at his chief, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. He gave Elizabeth one last look of pure hatred before turning and stalking away. The immediate threat was gone, but Elizabeth was shaken. The divisions within the tribe were as dangerous as the soldiers outside it. Soon the lookout gave the signal. The soldiers were in sight. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth began her lonely walk out of the valley and into the open snowfield. The column of blue coats was a terrifying sight, an organized line of death and steel. She walked slowly, her hands held open, her heart a drum beating against her ribs. They saw her. An officer at the front raised his hand, halting the column. He and two other soldiers rode forward, stopping a short distance away. The officer was young, with a tired but determined look in his eyes. "Ma'am," he called out. Are you a captive? No, Lieutenant, she replied, her voice steady. My name is Elizabeth Winters. The Cheyenne saved my daughters and me from the blizzard. She told him the story, the lies of Crawford's mill, the sabotaged wagon, the rescue. The lieutenant listened, his expression unreadable, his hand never straying far from his pistol. We've been tracking a war party that attacked a supply wagon, he said, his eyes scanning the camp behind her. The trail led here. These people are not warriors, Elizabeth insisted. They are families. They have been here all winter. Just then, a movement from the camp caught her eye. It was Stoneheart. He was walking out from behind a lodge, not toward her, but toward the main body of soldiers, waving a piece of white cloth. But tied to his other hand, struggling against his grip, was a small figure with strawberry blonde hair. Hannah. He was surrendering her daughter. A guttural roar of fury erupted from the camp as two bears saw the betrayal. Warriors appeared from their hidden positions, bows drawn. The soldiers, seeing the sudden appearance of armed hostiles and a man dragging a white child toward them, raised their rifles. The lieutenant swore, drawing his pistol. The air crackled with tension, a single breath away from a massacre. No! Elizabeth screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. She ran, not toward the soldiers, not toward the camp, but into the space between them, directly into the line of fire. He is a traitor. He is acting alone. The lieutenant, his face a mask of confusion and alarm, hesitated. His eyes flicked from Elizabeth to the approaching Stoneheart with the crying child, to the line of furious Cheyenne warriors. He was a young officer in an impossible situation, seconds away from giving an order that would soak the snow in blood. Stand down, he yelled at his men, his voice cracking with strain. Hold your fire. He spurred his horse forward, not toward the warriors, but toward Stoneheart. At the same moment, two bears broke from the Cheyenne line, sprinting across the snow with the speed of a charging buffalo. They converged on Stoneheart from two sides, a pincer movement of two leaders from opposing worlds, united for one brief, desperate moment by the need to save one small child. Stoneheart, seeing them coming, panicked. He shoved Hannah to the ground and turned to flee. But it was too late. Two bears tackled him, the two warriors crashing into the snow in a tangle of limbs and fury. The lieutenant reined in his horse beside Hannah, leaping from the saddle and scooping her into his arms. He held her protectively, his rifle pointed not at the Cheyenne, but at the struggling form of Stoneheart. The massacre had been averted, but the crisis had just begun. Lieutenant Michael Harrington now stood in the middle of a Cheyenne camp, holding a crying child, with 30 nervous soldiers at his back and a score of equally tense warriors in front of him. The peace was as thin and fragile as a sheet of ice over a raging river. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a fragile truce settled over the valley. Stoneheart was taken into custody by his own people, his betrayal having cost him all support. Lieutenant Harrington, holding the now calm Hannah, walked with Elizabeth and two bears back toward the center of the camp. The soldiers remained in place, their rifles lowered but ready. The Cheyenne warriors mirrored them, their bows unstrung but not put away. I need to know what's going on here, Mrs. Winters, Harrington said, his voice tight with the adrenaline of the near disaster. Everything you told me, I'm inclined to believe it, but I have orders. My orders are to protect my people, Two Bears stated, his gaze fixed on the lieutenant. Your presence here puts them in danger. My presence here is because a settlement leader, Sherman Crawford, reported his entire town witnessed your people abducting the Winters family after murdering her husband, Harrington shot back. The revelation hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Crawford hadn't just banished them to die. He had created an official narrative, a lie that would justify a military response against the Cheyenne and cement his own power. He had used her family as a pawn to incite a war. That is a lie, Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with rage. He forced us out. He tried to have us killed. I suspected as much, Harrington said grimly. I met your husband once, Mrs. Winters, at Fort Laramie last year. He was an honorable man. Crawford's story never sat right with me. That's why I led this patrol myself. A personal connection, a thread of fate she could never have imagined. Harrington turned to Two Bears. I need to search your camp for evidence of the supply wagon raid. If I find nothing, I can write in my report that Crawford's claim was false. But I have to look. Two Bears was reluctant. A search by soldiers was a deep insult, a violation of their sovereignty. But he looked at Elizabeth and at the faces of his people, and knew that cooperation was the only path that didn't lead to bloodshed. He agreed on the condition that Harrington and only two of his men would conduct the search, and they would be unarmed. It was during this tense inspection that the next twist was revealed. One of Harrington's men, an older, weathered private named Jenkins, stopped dead in his tracks as they passed a rack of drying hides. He pointed at a distinct brand on a leather saddlebag. "Sir," he said to Harrington, "I know that brand. That belongs to the traders from the supply wagon." A cold silence fell over the camp. Two Bears stared at the brand, his face unreadable. Harrington's expression hardened. "Chief," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you have some explaining to do." The discovery of the branded saddlebag was a bombshell. Stoneheart, held under guard, began to shout that he was right all along. The two Bears had traded with the raiders and lied to them all. The warriors grew agitated, the soldiers tensed, and the fragile peace began to crumble. "I have never seen this before," Two Bears said, his voice a low growl of controlled fury as he examined the brand. He turned to his warriors. "Who brought this into my camp?" No one spoke. The silence was damning. Harrington's face was grim. "I want to believe you, Chief, but this is hard evidence. My orders are clear." He was preparing to give the signal to his men to ready themselves for a fight. "Wait," Elizabeth said, her mind racing. "It doesn't make sense. If you had raided the wagon, why would you leave evidence like this out in the open?" She looked at the saddlebag again, at the way it was placed, not stored with other goods, but almost displayed. "It's a plant," she said suddenly. "Someone put it there for you to find." Harrington looked skeptical. "Who? And how?" "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. "But think about it. Who benefits from a war between the U.S. Army and the Cheyenne? Who wanted you to come here looking for a fight in the first place?" All eyes turned to the shouting figure of Stoneheart, but Two Bears shook his head. "Stoneheart is a warrior, not a schemer. This is not his work." Just then, Sage Woman, who had been observing the entire scene with her unnervingly calm gaze, spoke up. "The bag was brought 2 nights ago," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "by a boy, one of the Rabbit Society." She was referring to the youngest group of boys in the tribe, those not yet old enough to be warriors. Two Bears immediately called for the boy, a skinny, terrified 10-year-old named Little Owl. Trembling, the boy confessed. A man had met him while he was checking his rabbit snares at the edge of the valley. A white man. The man had given him a silver coin to place the bag where the soldiers would see it. He described the man. Large, with a thick beard and cold, pale eyes. Sherman Crawford. He had been here. He had not only pointed the army in this direction with his lies, but he had come himself to plant false evidence, to personally ensure that the spark he lit would erupt into a raging fire. The sheer diabolical depth of his evil was staggering, but the revelation posed a new terrifying question. If Crawford was close enough to sneak into the camp 2 nights ago, where was he now? "He's not working alone," Harrington said, his strategic mind immediately assessing the new threat. "He wouldn't risk coming this close without backup. He's out there, watching, waiting for us to start shooting each other." The situation had changed in an instant. They were no longer two opposing forces in a standoff. They were two groups, trapped in a valley, being manipulated by a common enemy who was hiding in the hills around them. But before they could even begin to formulate a plan, a single gunshot echoed from the ridge overlooking the camp. It wasn't aimed at the soldiers or the Cheyenne. It was aimed at the sky, a signal. Moments later, a new group of riders appeared on the opposite ridge. They were not soldiers. They were Lakota warriors, at least 30 of them, their faces painted for war. And at their head, sitting on a fine horse, was a man Elizabeth recognized with a jolt of horror. Silas Tanner, Crawford's right-hand man. Crawford hadn't just brought backup. He had forged an alliance with a hostile Lakota war party, likely promising them weapons and goods in exchange for helping him wipe out 2 of his enemies at once. The army patrol that was getting too close to his crimes and the Cheyenne tribe whose land he coveted. They were caught in a perfectly executed trap, pinned down in the valley with enemy forces on two sides, about to be caught in a devastating crossfire. The standoff had become a siege. The valley, once a sanctuary, was now a kill box. The appearance of the Lakota War Party, allied with Crawford's man, sent a fresh wave of panic through the camp. Women grabbed their children, pulling them into the relative safety of the lodges. Two Bears warriors fanned out, taking defensive positions, their faces grim. Harrington rapidly issued orders to his own men, directing them to use the terrain for cover. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and completely exposed. "They'll wait until dusk," Harrington said to Two Bears, the two leaders now standing side by side, their previous conflict forgotten in the face of a greater threat. "They'll use the fading light to attack from both ridges." Two Bears nodded in agreement. "We cannot break out. They hold the high ground." Elizabeth's mind was a whirlwind. This was all because of her. Her presence was the catalyst for this entire nightmare. But guilt was a useless emotion now. She had to think. What did Crawford want? He wanted the soldiers and the Cheyenne to destroy each other. He wanted chaos. But there was something else. He wanted her and her daughters dead, silent witnesses to his initial crime. That meant they were a target. And if they were a target, they could also be a weapon. "The Lakota don't know the whole story," she said, thinking aloud. "They're here because Crawford promised them something. They're his allies, but their alliance is built on a lie. What if they knew the truth?" Harrington looked at her like she was insane. "You want to what? Send a diplomat up that ridge? They'll kill anyone who approaches." "Not just anyone," Elizabeth said, a desperate, wild idea taking root in her mind. She looked at her daughters who were huddled with Sage Woman, their eyes wide with fear. "He called them the Sunrise Sisters," she whispered, remembering Two Bear's story about Jonathan. "A good omen." She turned back to the two leaders. "They expect warriors to fight. They don't expect children. They don't expect a mother walking between two chiefs under a white flag to ask for a parley." It was the most dangerous gamble of her life. They would be walking into the gun sights of two enemy forces, Crawford's men on one ridge, the Lakota on the other. But it was the only move their enemies wouldn't anticipate. Two Bears looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeing the raw courage and terrifying conviction in her gaze. He had seen her walk out to meet the soldiers. He knew the strength she possessed. "It is a path a coward would not walk," he said slowly, "and so it may be the path that leads to life." Harrington was harder to convince. "My duty is to protect my men, and you as a U.S. citizen. Walking you into an enemy camp is the opposite of that." "Your men are about to be slaughtered, Lieutenant," Elizabeth retorted. "Your duty is to find a way to keep them alive. This is the only way." Finally, reluctantly, he agreed. A white flag was fashioned from a strip of linen. Elizabeth knelt before her daughters. "Do you remember the story I told you about the brave princess who walked into the dragon's lair with nothing but a song?" She asked them, her voice miraculously calm. They both nodded. "Today we have to be those princesses. We have to be braver than we have ever been. We are going to walk up that hill and we are going to talk, and you must not be afraid." Sarah, ever her father's child, squared her small shoulders. "We won't be afraid, Mama." Hannah simply took her hand, her tiny grip a source of immense strength. The procession was in surreal sight, Elizabeth in the center, holding her daughter's hands. On her right, Two Bears, in his full ceremonial eagle feather headdress, a symbol of peace and authority. On her left, Lieutenant Harrington, his blue uniform a stark contrast, his sword sheathed as a sign of truce. They walked slowly, deliberately, up the slope toward the ridge where Silas Tanner and the Lakota watched. Rifles were leveled at them. Arrows were nocked in bows. Every step was a lifetime. They stopped in the open, halfway up the hill. "I asked to speak with the Lakota chief," Elizabeth called out, her voice carrying in the still cold air. For a long moment, there was no response. Then a single warrior detached from the group and rode down to meet them. He was imposing, his face a mask of suspicion. He was Spotted Eagle, the Lakota war chief. He ignored Elizabeth and Harrington, addressing only Two Bears in the common sign language of the plains. Why does a Cheyenne chief walk with the blue coats? Two bears signed back. The man you ride with, the white man, is a snake. He has deceived you as he has deceived us. He wishes for Lakota and Cheyenne to kill each other, so he can take all our lands. Spotted Eagle looked skeptical. He pointed toward Crawford's men on the other ridge. They are not our enemies. It was then that Elizabeth stepped forward, pushing her daughters gently in front of her. Ask him, she said to Two Bears, if the snake promised him that he could have the white women and children as prizes when the battle was over. Two Bears translated the sign. A flicker of something, surprise, shame, crossed Spotted Eagle's face. He looked at the two little girls, their identical faces pale but resolute, and then at Elizabeth. He had been promised them. Crawford, in his infinite cruelty, had used her family as a bargaining chip. Spotted Eagle was a hard man, a warrior who had seen much death. But he was also a man of honor, and there was no honor in a war fought over the bodies of children. He turned and looked back at Silas Tanner, and then across the valley at Sherman Crawford, who was now visible, watching through a spyglass. He saw the greed, the deception. He saw that he was not an ally, he was a tool. With a final, disgusted look at Tanner, Spotted Eagle raised his hand and gave a sharp, decisive signal to his warriors. It was not the signal to attack. It was the signal to withdraw. The Lakota had just switched sides. The betrayal by his Lakota allies left Sherman Crawford and his handful of men dangerously exposed. Seeing the tide turn so dramatically, he and Tanner didn't wait. They opened fire, a desperate, chaotic volley aimed not at anyone in particular, but meant to create confusion for their escape. As bullets whizzed through the air, Harrington and Two Bears shielded Elizabeth and the girls, rushing them back to the safety of the camp. The soldiers and Cheyenne warriors, now a unified fighting force, returned fire, pinning Crawford's men down. "They're trying to circle around to the west," Harrington yelled, pointing to where the gunmen were retreating. "They know a path out of these hills." "My warriors will cut them off," Two Bears declared, issuing a series of sharp commands. The Cheyenne, moving with breathtaking speed and knowledge of the terrain, melted into the trees, a flanking force of ghost-like archers. The battle was short and decisive. Caught between the disciplined rifle fire of the soldiers and the deadly accuracy of the Cheyenne arrows, Crawford's men were quickly overwhelmed. Two were killed, and the rest, including a wounded Silas Tanner, surrendered. But Crawford himself was gone. He had abandoned his men, using the firefight as a diversion to slip away. By the time the fighting stopped, dusk had fallen. The valley was quiet again, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and pine smoke. An unbelievable alliance had been forged in the crucible of battle. Soldiers shared their canteens with Cheyenne warriors. Private Jenkins, who had some medical training, helped Sage Woman tend to the wounded from both sides. But Crawford was still at large. "He won't get far," Harrington said, his face a grim mask of determination. "He's on foot in territory he doesn't know. We'll find him." Two Bears dispatched his best trackers, warriors who could read a broken twig or a displaced stone like a page in a book. They would hunt Crawford down. That night, a joint council was held around a large fire in the center of the camp. The Lakota chief, Spotted Eagle, was invited as a guest of honor. He formally renounced any pact with Crawford and pledged a temporary truce with the Cheyenne and the soldiers. "The white man Crawford," Spotted Eagle said, his voice heavy, "he fights with the poison of lies. It is a dishonorable way to wage war. We will not be his puppets." The atmosphere was one of profound, weary relief. They had faced annihilation and emerged not just victorious, but transformed. Barriers that had stood for generations had been shattered in a single day. Elizabeth sat with her daughters, wrapped in a warm buffalo robe, watching the unlikely gathering. She had thought her family was a loose end for Crawford to snip. Instead, they had become the thread that unraveled his entire evil scheme. Late into the night, a Cheyenne tracker returned. He was not empty-handed. He carried a leather satchel, Crawford's satchel. He had dropped it during his escape. Inside, among personal effects, was a ledger book. It was filled with meticulous, damning entries, records of illegal whiskey sales to the Lakota, details of the bribes he paid to territorial officials, and a detailed plan, written in his own hand, to incite conflict between the tribes and the army, with the goal of having the land declared hostile territory, voiding all treaties and opening it up for him to claim. But the most chilling discovery was a series of maps. One was the map he had given Elizabeth, leading to Widow's Pass. The others were maps of the surrounding territory, with notes on other families from Crawford's Mill who had disappeared over the last 2 years. Each disappearance corresponded to a route leading to a known natural hazard, a ravine, a flash flood canyon, a wolf den. Crawford wasn't just a tyrant. He was a serial murderer, systematically eliminating anyone who opposed him and using the vast, unforgiving wilderness as his accomplice. The next morning, the hunt for Crawford began in earnest. A joint party of soldiers and Cheyenne trackers, led by Harrington and two bears, set out at dawn. They would not return until he was found. Elizabeth remained in the camp, which had become a strange and wonderful hub of diplomacy. Cheyenne, Lakota, and soldiers were now actively working together, sharing information and planning for a future that looked radically different than it had just 2 days before. 3 days later, the hunting party returned. They had found him. Cornered in a box canyon, desperate and half-mad from exposure, Crawford had made one last stand. He was dead. Justice, swift and final, had been delivered by the very wilderness he had sought to use as a weapon. With the immediate threat gone, the future became the new focus. Lieutenant Harrington knew his report on these events would send shockwaves through the military command. An officer allying with Cheyenne and Lakota warriors to hunt down a white settlement leader? It was unprecedented. But he had the evidence, Crawford's own ledger, and the testimony of his men. The story of what had happened in this valley had to be told. Before he left, Harrington had a private conversation with Elizabeth. "What will you do now, Mrs. Winters?" he asked. "You are free to go anywhere. I can arrange a military escort to Fort Laramie, and from there, passage back east." Elizabeth looked around the camp. She looked at her daughters laughing as they played a game with Cheyenne and Lakota children. This place, born of terror and desperation, had become home. The people she was taught to fear had become her family. Her own people had cast her out to die. These people had risked everything to protect her. "I don't think we'll be going back east, Lieutenant," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I think our adventure is just beginning." She had Jonathan's books, filled with his notes on engineering and agriculture. She had her own knowledge as a teacher. The tribes faced a changing world, one that threatened to sweep away their way of life. Perhaps she and the girls could help, not as outsiders but as part of the community, as bridge builders. Two bears who had approached and overheard nodded in solemn agreement. "The Sunrise Sisters brought a new day to this valley," he said. "Their mother, the bridge builder, will help us walk in its light." The decision felt right, solid, and true. Their journey had not ended with their rescue from the snow. That had been the beginning. Cast out as burdens, they had found their purpose. In the harshest winter, in the face of unimaginable cruelty, they had found not just survival, but a new kind of family, a new way of life, and a future they would build together, a bridge between two worlds. The story of the Winter's Choice, as it came to be called, became a quiet legend on the frontier. A story of how a mother's promise, a chief's compassion, and a lieutenant's integrity could avert a war and forge an alliance that no one thought possible. It was a testament to the fact that even in the most divided of times, our shared humanity can be the most powerful weapon of all. If this story resonated with you and you believe that courage and compassion can be found in the most unexpected of places, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We explore incredible stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. What would you have done in Elizabeth's place? Let us know in the comments below. And until next time, stay curious and question everything.